everyone, before we get into today's video, I just want to mention how I've been trying recently to be consistent with uploads. So I would very much appreciate if you liked and subscribed, as I'm trying my best to grow and provide the best content I possibly can. Thank you. Los Angeles is home to almost 118 million parking spaces. Trying to wrap your head around that is almost as difficult as distorting quantum physics, but it's a fact. Of those 118 million, many of them reside in the multi-story parking garages that litter the city, going both high up into the sky and down into the earth, looking very much like the tunnels of an ant colony. Some are in terrific shape, while others look like they need to have a condemned notice slapped on them. But regardless of their condition, they're an integral part of the city's car-centric infrastructure. And for 6 months in the early 2000s, I worked at one of them as a security guard. For reasons I won't say which, but I came across the job listing while browsing through the classified section of the LA Times. Shortly after moving from Barstow, even to this day, I can still perfectly recall it, seeking individual to work security for graveyard shift at parking garage. Experience preferred, but not required. Willing to train the right individual, as I was running low on my savings at a mass during my high school days. I needed a steady stream of cash pronto. So I called the number and scheduled an interview. I'm not gonna lie, I was nervous as hell when I met the manager, but to my luck, it turned out that I didn't need to be. I got the job the very same day, and after going over my schedule, I was introduced to the man who I would not only be taught the reps from, but would also be my partner. Ronnie was the kind of man you could take one look at and know instinctively not to mess with. A hulking man in his early 60s, he was a veteran of the Vietnam War, sporting a large scar that ran down one side of his face, which he simply said came from a close encounter during his time in it. He had spent the last 30 years working security. I'd worked this gig for the last 15. I'd been slightly intimidated when I was first introduced to him, as he'd stood in front of me, hair styled in a military crew cut, but as soon as the manager had left our site, he cracked a smile that instantly relaxed me and patted me on the shoulder. Just follow my lead, kid, and everything will be fine. And for the first 3 or 4 months, it had been. The money it paid wasn't exactly jaw-dropping, but helped pay the rent on my dingbat apartment I rented soon after getting the job, the bills, and the insurance on the small, early 80s Alfa Romeo convertible I'd been given by my uncle before leaving home. I even had a little extra money left over each month to splurge, which, after the measly pay I'd gotten working cashier jobs at drive-thrus, was heaven to my 23-year-old self. The hours were also perfect for a night owl like me, and each night as Ronnie and I did our rounds, working back and forth between the underground levels to the roof section 6 or 7 stories above the street, the man would crack me up, telling jokes as we swapped stories. Eventually, we began to split up, swooping each level of the closed parking garage on our own to make sure nobody was sleeping in the cars and trucks which were parked overnight in the sea of spaces, or hiding in the dark corners where the overhead lights had burnt out. Occasionally, we've had to shoot out some less than scrupulous characters, opening the metal shutters and pushing them out, but nothing severe ever happened, and as eerie as the place could seem at times, being so quiet after buzzing during the day, it never really creeped me out. One night, though, it changed. It started a few days into the 5th month of my employment. It wasn't anything that set off any red flags at first. I'd be walking on my own through one of the levels, shining my flashlight around and looking between the line of cars, when a small shiver would shoot up my spine. It would shoot through me like a bolt of electricity, and I would stop in my tracks, trying to understand what had caused it. The first few occasions, I simply chalked it up to the weather. It was fall, and the temperature was dropping compared to the highs there had been in the summer. I'd simply shake my head and continue on my way. But when I continued to experience it after showing up to work wearing a heavier hoodie or jacket, it began to take on a truly creepy aura. And worse, as it went on, I began to feel eyes on me. I thought I was merely going through a little stir crazy or something. After all, it didn't happen every single night, and every single time the feeling came over me, and I'd turn around to shine the light behind me, the beam would reflect only off the parked cars, which was the only sounds heard besides the distant wail of sirens and the rotor chop of helicopters, outside being the steady drip of water from the leaking pipes in the ceiling. At one point, I radioed Ronnie, asking if he'd ever gotten the feeling as well. His words reassured me. Absolutely, Seth. I freely admit the first few months I was posted here, this place kind of gave me the heebie-jeebies. Hell, why shouldn't it? When you're one of the only people in such a large structure, nobody else around it can give off almost the same vibe as a haunted house. Don't worry, it'll go away soon enough. Happy to know I wasn't merely being a little chicken shit. I attempted to ignore this feeling every time I felt it. I was confident that it would pass, as Ronnie had told me, but it didn't. If anything, it began to get worse. I would be walking, humming a song softly to myself, when the feeling would fall over me. I'd stop dead in my tracks, and I swore, just for a second, that I heard another set of footsteps echoing in the silence. They always stopped almost as soon as mine did, to the point I almost half believed that they were merely my own, echoing back at me off the concrete that the parking garages were always made out of, which seemed to reflect and amplify sounds more than anywhere else. But what always seemed unnerved me was that they ceased so abruptly, as if someone didn't want me to hear them. I began to carry a butterfly knife I brought on my shifts. Ronnie had a pistol on his service belt, but it was his own. Management didn't provide any supplies beyond the radio and flashlight, and I didn't exactly have the funds to grab myself a Glock or Beretta, so I'd simply walk with it tied in my free hand, ready to flip it open and defend myself if the need arose. The next thing that happened occurred about a week or so later. I was halfway down the garage, heading for the underground levels, when the radio on my belt squawkled. Seth, come in please. Over. I reached down and plucked it off my belt, thumbing the transmit button. Seth here. Ronnie? What's up? Over. Ronnie was a stickler for proper radio etiquette, a trait from his time in the military. The radio crackled again. I need you to come over and join me. There's something I just came across that needs to be reported. Over. A small wave of concern washed over me. He's never phrased it like that before. Oh, great. What happened? Did he find a junkie OD'd in a car? My mind racing with the possibilities. I hit the button and spoke. Roger that. Where are you? Over. He responded almost immediately. I'm on the top floor. Over. Walking quickly, I climbed back the way I'd come, always keeping an eye out behind me. The feeling of being watched hadn't come tonight, mercifully, but I was staying on guard regardless. I began to wonder if someone had died here at some point and the place was haunted. I shook my head and kept walking. Knock it off, man. Don't wear yourself out. A few minutes later, I reached the top level and jogged across the expansive space. Ronnie was standing near an alcove located in the far corner. The light above it either burned out or smashed. He had to use his flashlight to light up the area. I reached him, panting a little bit as I bent over and put my hands on my knees. After a moment, I stood up straight. What's up, Ronnie? I asked him. In response, he turned and aimed the flashlight into the alcove. For a moment, I couldn't understand what he was showing me. Then it clicked, as I saw what the beam landed on. The door, which opened onto the stairwell, which led down to the street level, hung open. Looks like someone jimmied the lock when her bags were turned, my friend, he said grimmingly. For some reason, the man's words made it feel as though a vice had closed around my heart. I remember the feeling of being watched, along with the footsteps I swore I'd heard shadowing me. Whether this was related or not, the sound of the ajar door, which normally stood firmly locked, did not help in the slightest. I looked up at Ronnie, forcing my voice to not betray the emotions I felt. So, what do we do? He thought for a second, then reached for a Motorola cell phone and clipped to his belt. I'm gonna call this in, both to the cops and management, he said. Then we're going to stick together and clear this garage, one level at a time. By the time we get to the ground level, they should be here. With that, he turned away, dialing a number into the cell phone. I listened quietly as I heard him speaking for a few minutes, before ending the call and dialing the police. As he spoke to them, I cast another look at the parked cars, which now almost seemed to resemble panthers in the gloom, crouched and waiting to pounce on anything that wandered too close. Nothing moved in the stillness, but even still, I swore it felt to me like that shadow seemed to grow a little darker. Once Ronnie finished the call, he withdrew his pistol from its holster. He didn't rack around in the chamber, but he did flick off the safety, keeping it loose in his hand and pointing at the floor. Turning to me, he gave a short nod and whispered a single sentence to me. Stay close to me. Understand? I nodded quickly in turn, and together, the two of us began the slow, almost excruciating process of clearing each floor. To say it felt like an eternity as we wound our way through each line of cars, occasionally shining our lights into their interiors, would be like calling the Challenger disaster a slight mistake. My heart was beating like a tambourine inside my chest, and my breathing came shallow as I strained my ears to hear anything out of place. I gripped the closed butterfly knife tight in my fist, feeling as on edge as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. As we reached the second floor, rounding the ramp and passing a 70s Cadillac and GMC Vendera, the feeling of being stared at suddenly swept through me like I'd been hit by a rogue wave. That wasn't what sent a bolt of fear cruising through me, though. Here's what I swore I'd felt as I hurried to match Ronnie's pace. I'd sworn that, for a split second, I'd felt fingertips brushing against the nape of my neck. Oh, fuck me, running man. Letting out an audible gasp of air, I spun around quickly, yanking my flashlight up and, in one fluid motion, flipping open my knife. Ready to lash out at the first thing I saw, the word blurred for a second. But when it regained itself, it was to see that nobody was there, no figure, corporeal or spirit lurked in the shadows staring into my soul. Even still, I felt the tendrils or fear jamming themselves into my veins. Adrenaline coursing along with them, I swung the flashlight back and forth. There was still nobody. Vaguely, I realized that Ronnie's footsteps had halted and felt more than heard him step back by my side. "What do you see?" he asked in a deadly serious voice. The tone was one I'd never heard him use before, and even though the situation, I momentarily had a mental image of him dressed in camouflage fatigues, an M16 in his hand, as he crept through the jungle. I took a deep breath and then spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. I swear for a second when we passed those two cars. I pointed to the Cadillac and van, but I felt something directly behind me. But when I turned back, no one was there. I breathed in a deep lungful of air and looked at him. His eyes were hard. He held up a hand to me. "Wait here," he instructed, then tucking his flashlight's hand under his gun hand, he raised the pistol and moved forward, crouching slightly to look under the two vehicles. A moment later, he ran to the side of the van and disappeared from sight. The moments that ticked by felt like hours as I waited for him to reappear. Even though it was irrational, I was suddenly overcome with the certainty that he wouldn't be coming back. That, if anyone or anything came back around the corner, it wouldn't be him. My heart began to race inside my chest again. Thankfully, and to my great relief, he reappeared a moment later, looking almost as relieved as I felt. He shook his head at me as he stepped back next to me. "Nobody's there, Seth." He jerked his head in the direction we'd been heading. "Come on, let's keep going. The police will be here any minute, if they're not already." The rest of the trek down was uneventful, something I thank the good Lord for a million times over. Ronnie had been correct as well. When we rounded the corner to the metal shutters, it was to see a Chevy Caprice patrol car parked in front of them, the headlights and spotlight aimed inside. Two patrolmen stood nearby, and Ronnie quickly holstered his pistol as they aimed their light at us. "You guys the security guards you called?" one asked, a small layer of suspicion in his voice. "Yeah, that's right," Ronnie answered, jogging to the keypad and punching in the code to raise them before continuing. The stairwell door at the top had been pried open. My partner and I, he gestured towards me, cleared the levels down to here, but we didn't check out the underground levels. The officer nodded, then motioned to his partner, who climbed back into the cruiser. "Wait here while my partner and I do a sweep," he ordered. After closing the shutters behind him, the two of us stood near the entrance booth for them to return. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then I glanced over at him. To my surprise, I saw a look on his face I never had before. There was a mix of trepidation, concern, and, was that an inking of fear? In the time I'd known the man, with the sole exception of the few times he'd spoken about the horrors he'd seen during Vietnam, nothing had rattled him. And seeing him in such a state, to put it lightly, unsettled me. Something was worming its way through my mind, something I wanted to ask him. I hesitated for a moment before opening my mouth. "You felt it, too, haven't you, Ronnie? You felt exactly what I have. The sensation that we are not alone here. The sound of footsteps behind you." He didn't reply for a while, then turned to me. The usual stoic bravado plastered there once more. He shook his head at me, his voice firm. "No, I haven't, Seth. Like I told you at the beginning, any feeling, not counting tonight as that's a different story, will fade in time. It's just because of how eerie such a place like a mall or parking garage feels when it's empty and devoid of people. It's like being the only one left after the apocalypse. He put a hand on my shoulder, giving me the same look as my father used to when telling me the facts of life. Don't lose your wits, kid. That's what that leads to you getting hurt. Listen to your gut, yes, but don't forget to use your head. And above all, don't let your imagination get the best of you. And with that, he turned to watch the cops again. The cruiser rounded the bend a few minutes later, the police exiting to inform us that nobody had been found. They left us a case number for the manager to call on the boarding, and then reminding us to call if we noticed anything else out of the ordinary before leaving. As I watched the taillights of the Caprice disappear, the shutters again descending to block the way out, a voice suddenly came from over my shoulder. Behind you. For a moment, I felt my heart somersault in my chest, and I swiveled around, but I let out a breath I hadn't realized I've been holding when I saw Ronnie's mischievous grin staring back at me. I let out an astonished laugh before reaching out and shoving him. You're seriously an asshole. You know that, man? I growled, but failing to stop the grin that spread over my own face. He let out a laugh of his own. You know, it's funny. When Jay Mansfield came to visit us in the barracks and infirmary, and I told her one of my jokes, she told me the exact same thing. For whatever reason, that made me burst into laughter, which he matched. We stood there for a moment, our laughs echoing away into the immense structure. Then, the two of us began our walk back up to the main level. Thankfully, nothing more happened that night, and the feeling I had didn't return either. The next few weeks went by uneventfully. Normality resumed, and the slight impulse I had to quit melted away. The manager was impressed with our work, and after a good word put in for me by Ronnie, I received a nice raise. One which meant in my savings account got a nice boost in its contents. I made a few new friends, and even got myself a girlfriend after bumping into a beautiful blonde, my biggest weakness, at the Whiskey A Go-Go during one of my nights off. The world seemed to be my oyster, and I felt like I was on top of the world. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Until that night. I'd ended up a little late for my shift due to, well, the sorts of thing that men and their girlfriends get up to when home alone. And after giving Jerry a key to lock up the apartment when she left, I called Ronnie on my landline, leaving him a message on his cell to apologize for being late and let him know I'm on my way. And I flew out the door and practically leapt into my Alpha, despite feeling a little guilty I had, for the first time since getting the job, left my partner hanging. I still couldn't help but grin as I sped along the city streets, mine still a little behind me in bed with Jerry. As I came within a few blocks of the garage, I reached into my center console and pulled out a cassette tape, sliding it into the car stereo and hitting play. The drum beats and synthesizers of Michael Cimbero's Manic began blasting out of the speakers, and with the convertible top down, I had added a sense of adventure and urgency to the drive. I allowed my foot to press a little harder down on the accelerator, the roar of the car's engine mixing with the music and wind. The front of the garage came into view as I rounded the final corner, and I pressed on a button which I had affixed to the top of the windshield. It controlled the shutters and allowed Ronnie and I to get into the garage without leaving our cars. Seeing it was raised enough to get inside without slowing, I, admittedly, was a bit of a jackass and took the corner a little too hard, the rear end of my Alpha fishtailing as I flew under the shutters and into the garage. I slowed just enough to hit the button again, then began my ascent to the top level. It was a routine for me by now to park at the top and begin my sweep by heading straight down to the underground levels and work my way back up. I drove each ramp a little too fast, flying down each aisle of cars, the music and roar of the engine echoing like machine gun fire in the enclosed space and drowning anything else out. Finally, I reached the top, and with a final yank on the parking brake, I slid with a screech of tires into an empty space. Shutting off the engine, I pulled the top up and fastened it. Before climbing out of the car, my ears rang slightly in the sudden silence. I rushed in to take the maelstrom of noise I'd caused, and I stared around, looking to see if I could see Ronnie during his rounds. He'd surely have to have heard me enter. Seeing nothing, I shrugged my shoulders and slammed my door shut. The loud, metallic slam of steel echoed like a gunshot in the silence. I locked the door, and after retrieving my radio and flashlight from the trunk, I turned it on and pressed down on the transmit button. Hey Ronnie, this is Seth. Come in, buddy. Over. I stood there for a few moments, waiting for a reply, but none came. I felt a small knot of worry begin tying itself in my stomach. I seriously hope I didn't piss the dude off, not after all he's done for me. I pressed down on the button again. Hey Ronnie, I'm sorry I came a little late. I lost track of time. Hope you can forgive me. I took a breath before finishing. I'm gonna get started on my rounds. Okay? Over. Almost as soon as I let go of the button, the radio began to crackle, signaling someone had begun transmitting on their end of the radio. Several sharp crackles of static emitted from the speaker, and then I heard Ronnie's voice answer me, sounding muffled in the wave of static. Copy that. As soon as the second word had left his lips, the radio went silent again. I stared at the radio for a moment, then clipped it to my belt, sighing heavily. Shit. The man clearly was pissed at me, as he only spoke curtly when he was in a bad mood. I resolved when I came across him that I apologized properly, and stressed to him that I would never be late again, for now, though. Let's just get to work. The trek down to the underground levels was uneventful. I saw nobody and had no eerie feeling as I flashed my light into a few cars, peering between them and loudly humming Manic. The song was firmly stuck in my head and would likely stay there for the rest of the night, to my surprise. However, I didn't see hide or hair of Ronnie. I felt for sure that I'd bump into him heading up to the top of my way down, but I hadn't so much as heard his footsteps. The man's probably heading up the ramps to the opposite side of the garage to keep distance from me, I thought. The notion made another well of shame and sadness wash over me, and I felt like I grated a pig for screwing up. As I headed down into the 2 underground levels, I hoped against that. For whatever reason, the radio would crackle with the promise of a message coming through it. And, to my great relief, as I finished my rounds of the underground, it did. Seth, come in, please. Over. The static caused by the concrete almost drowned out its voice, but it was still unmistakable. Smiling slightly, I pulled the radio from my belt. Seth here. I'm honestly happy to hear from you. As dumb as that might sound, man. What's up? Over. There was a few seconds of silence, then the radio crackled again. I need you to come and join me. Over. I began to head for the ramp back out the ground level, fumbling the radio again. Roger that, Ronnie. Everything all good? Over. Another few seconds of silence, then. I need you to come and join me. Over. I stopped walking for a second, lifting the radio and staring at it as my brow furrowed. Okay, that was weird. He's not usually one to repeat himself. He usually expands the situation. Suddenly, a thought occurred to me, and I groaned. Oh, God. Don't tell me someone pried open one of the staircase doors again. I hit the transmit button, yet again, speaking professionally. Roger that. I'm on my way. Where are you at? Over. After a second, he answered. Top floor. For a split second, something nagged at my mind, and I pushed it away, replying to him a final time before hurrying up. Copy that. On my way. Over. I hustled up the levels in silence for the next few minutes. The only sounds I could hear aside from the ones flittering in from the city outside and being my own labyrinth breaths. By the time I reached the top, my lungs felt like they were on fire. Okay, it's official. I need to get my ass back into the gym regularly. Being this out of shape from a simple jog up 6 stories is not how the former captain of the swim team should be. Chuckling slightly, I slowed to walk. Pulling out my flashlight and flicking it on, I saw no sign of Ronnie. Remembering my idea about the door, I headed to the far corner, which as usual was covered in gloom. However, I felt another pang of surprise as I saw no sign of him over here, either. What? What the hell? He specifically asked me to come to the top level. Where the hell was he? I pulled the radio from my belt and thumbed it. Ronnie, come in please. Man, I'm on the top floor, but I don't see you. Where are you? Over. As I released the transmit button, I was only greeted by static. I stood there for a few seconds, remembering the delay in his responses previously. When almost a minute had passed by without a response, I tried raising him again. Ronnie, this is Seth. I'm at the top floor, where you asked me to join you. But unless I ended up in an alternate reality, you're not up here. Care to tell me where you're at? Over. I waited again, another minute or two passing. I shot a look around, aiming my light slightly to see if he was making his way through the aisle of cars, but there was no movement in the stillness. A slight sense of irritation began to bubble up inside me as a thought suddenly occurred to me. Oh, this better not be a sort of punishment for being late. I know he's peeved, but this is seriously taking it too far. Feeling a heat of anger sweep through me, I stabbed the transmit button harder than I should, my voice coming out harsher than I anticipated. Okay, man, I'm seriously starting to get pissed off here. I'm sorry that I was fucking late, but we don't have to be freaking childish about this shit, okay? Now, do me a favor and tell me where the fuck you're at. Over. For a few seconds, there was nothing, and then another wave of static came through, followed by two words. Behind you. My face scrunched up at the two words. What? What the hell is that supposed to mean? I just looked behind me. Nobody's there. I hit the transmit button, beginning to speak. Okay, you want to clarify what the heck? But my voice cut off. As the same nagging thought swarmed forward in my mind. Only now, I let it come to the forefront as the thing I'd found odd clearly presented itself to me. He didn't say, over. Slowly, I raised the radio in my hand, staring at it as though it would provide me with answers my mind so clearly was searching for. Another puzzle piece connected. Ronnie's military training would never allow him to finish a radio transmission without the correct lingo. He even told you as such as the first day you met. I whispered out in the gloom, what the hell is going on? That's when a sound began behind me. It was soft at first, like a lover guiding their partner to the bedroom, but it slowly rose in volume and intensity as the sounds clicked by. I listened hard, attempting to pin down which direction it was coming from, but it almost seemed a futile effort. The sound kept growing louder, almost as if it were getting closer to me, and as it rose a little louder, I suddenly realized what it was. Humming. It was the sound of someone humming in the gloom. I twisted around, shined my light, but still unable to see where it was coming from. The sound echoed off the walls, making it look like it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. As I listened harder, I suddenly realized two things in quick succession. The first was a song that was being hummed. It was the very song I'd been listening to as I drove up in my car. The second was what caused a familiar, yet extremely unwanted shiver to shoot up my spine. It wasn't Ronnie. I'd heard that man hum before. He'd always sounded extremely low-pitched, like a bear growling. This sounded higher-pitched, yet still clearly a man. Another shiver shot through me as I suddenly became aware of another noise echoing off the walls. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Ones that sounded like someone wearing heavy work boots were rapidly approaching from somewhere off in the gloom. Another huge shiver shot up my spine. My heart began to beat rapidly in my chest. Normally, I'm someone who isn't afraid of confrontation. I've had my fair share of scrapes in my life. This time, however, between the creepy humming that was clearly not my partner, the rapidly approaching footsteps, and the strange response I'd received over the radio from Ronnie, every instinct in my body was telling me that confronting whoever this person was, even with a knife in my pocket, would be a mistake. I might not live to regret, and so, remembering Ronnie's words about trusting my instincts and gut, I clicked the flashlight off and allowed myself to melt in the shadows. Steps approached quicker, the man still humming maniac, as I slipped in between two cars, moving rapidly for the small space between their front bumpers and concrete, flattening myself out as much as possible. I slid against the front bumper of an Explorer and held my breath. The footsteps and humming got louder, until I began to hear my ears ringing from the sound. I realized I could finally pinpoint the sound. The footsteps were almost directly on the opposite end of the SUV. My heart thundered in my chest, and despite the attempt to stay calm, I couldn't help but feel fear sweep through me. The footsteps stopped for a moment. The humming continued. The man began to quickly hum the chorus, almost as if it were a sort of taunt. I began to do something I hadn't in years. I began to pray. Please, just keep going. Don't step or come back here. Keep going. For what felt like an eternity, the humming continued opposite me. Then, mercifully, the footsteps began again, now heading away in the direction of the stairwell door. Trying to stay as quiet as possible, I fought to think of a plan. If I could only make it to my car, I could race down to the ground level and get out of here, find a payphone and call the cops. Whoever this fucker is, he's giving off psychopath vibes, and whether Ronnie's okay or not, I can't help him if he catches me, but shit. My car's in the direction he went. If I try and get to it, I run the risk of running straight into him. So what do? I raced through the options, but only one kept presenting itself to me. I would have to, without being spotted, creep down to the ground level and manually enter the code to raise the shutters. Then, I would have to race away like my life depended on it, which, in this case, it felt like it did. I could still faintly hear the humming and footsteps as they kept retreating in the opposite direction. The prospect of making it down 6 levels with Nutcase wandering around was not appealing in the slightest, but I had no choice. Taking a quiet, deep breath, I began to move. Slowly, but steadily, using each car as a cover. I didn't move too quickly as I didn't want to make too much noise, but I didn't allow myself to falter. I kept moving, making it to the first ramp, taking a huge breath and staying crouched. I dashed down the looping circle to the floor below. I stopped by a car to catch my breath momentarily and listened. I thought I could just about hear the sound of humming coming from somewhere above me. Feeling confident I had made it down unseen, I kept going. I repeated the same process, reaching the last row of cars and eyeing the ramp down to the 4th level. I prepared myself to make another dash. That's when the radio on my belt, which I'd confidently forgotten about, crackled to life. I froze like a statue for a split second, and then I felt my blood turn to ice in my veins as the sound began splitting from the speakers. This time, though, it was not Ronnie's voice. It was the sound of the man humming, the tone now containing a malicious glee in it. With a sudden horrific realization, I understood what he was doing. My hands flew to my belt, and I tore at the radio's volume controls. I snapped it off, then held my breath, listening as hard as I could. I prayed I had been far down enough away that he couldn't pinpoint my location. The sound of rapidly approaching footsteps from just above my head told me they had not been heard. Fuck. Trying to stay as quiet as before, I made a mad dash for the ramp. As I reached it, I risked a glance behind me. This level of the parking garage, almost all the lights had burnt out, but there was enough coming in from outside that I clearly saw the outline of a figure standing at the base of the ramp on the opposite end. The sight caused a tremendous bolt of fear to shoot through me. I didn't allow myself to stare any longer. I just crouched, ran down the ramp, keeping my gaze on the ground in front of me. Mercifully, I reached the 4th level safely. Moving on the balls of my feet, I slid in amongst the next row of cars as I heard the footsteps slowly sound up from above me. Before going silent, I waited to hear if I could hear them begin again, then slowly began to move among the cars. I was halfway down the row when I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. Confident that I hadn't been pursued down to this level yet, I had reached out and put my hand against the bumper of the nearest car to steady myself, and froze. My eyes widened, and I slowly turned my head to the sensation I felt. When I reached out and put my hand against the bumper, I'd expect to feel the cool sensation of metal. Instead, I felt something sticky and warm. I looked at what car I'd leaned against. Vaguely, I became aware I was crouching behind the same panel van I'd sworn I'd felt the sensation of fingers brush against me as I passed. It had been reversed into the parking lot space. I could see the GMC logo glinting in the overhead lights. I saw the white paint peeling in places. Then my eyes lowered to the bottom of the rear doors. I kept my mouth shut to keep from screaming. This level was still rather gloomy, but there were still enough lights to see something was leaking out from beneath the bottom of the rear doors, dripping down into the metal bumper and down into the concrete, forming a small pool, a pool that was the same color that stained the palm of my hand, crimson. My breathing began to come in short, a loud gasp as I stared at the blood on my hands, and then my heart almost stopped as a sound came from somewhere behind me, yet clearly on the same level as me, the sound of chuckling. I began to shake with fear, realizing what whoever this psycho was, and whatever he'd done with my partner, you know exactly what he did with Ronnie. My mind whispered, he made it soundlessly down to the same level. I fought to get my breathing under control, and trying to stay silent, I began to move forward again. I slid around a Mercedes and a BMW, peering around the bumper of a truck to make sure he hadn't gotten ahead of me. That's when something came flying through the air, crashing to the ground almost directly in front of me. I froze like a statue, mind attempting to process what had just happened, and then looked down at the object. When I saw it made all the terror and horror sweeping through my system climax. Ronnie's radio, shattered against the concrete and smeared with blood. The sudden, horrific conclusion came flying forward in my mind, one which was worse than any other. He threw it exactly where you are. He knows exactly where you are. As it slammed into me like a truck, another, equally terrifying sensation came over me. The sensation of eyes boring into the back of my skull. Slowly, almost unwillingly, I turned to look behind me. My eyes went wide. Crouched only a few cars behind me was the outline of a tall man. Through the tinted windows, I couldn't make out any details, only the figure. One who was clearly crouching and staring through the glass on the other side, directly at me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. It burst out of me. I opened my mouth and screamed. A sound more horrified than I've ever heard come from both of me, or have since. I lost my composure then and there. I leapt from my hiding spot and began sprinting away, running into the middle of the aisle. Behind me, I heard another of those sickening chuckles, now filled with the same tone as a teenager who successfully punked their best friend, only this was more evil than I've ever heard in my entire life. I honestly don't know if he followed me all the way down to the gate, or he simply remained where he'd been, reveling in the terror he'd filled me with. I don't know why he simply toyed with me and didn't kill me. All I know is, I somehow made it to the keypad, stabbing the code and then dashing for the shutter as it raised, crawling under it and racing into the street. Almost like Providence, a patrol car had been curling past when I raced out. I can only imagine how I must have looked to them as I flagged them down, one head covered in blood and scared out of my mind, but I can only guess they understood enough, because they radioed in for background immediately. That horrifying night was over 20 years ago. The police searched that parking garage top to bottom, trying to find any trace of the man, but, to my despair, I was later told that they found the same door that had been pried open before, standing open on the top floor, and with no cameras in the garage, there was no way to identify him. They did find Ronnie, however. That blood I'd slid my hand into against the van, it had been his. The grim-looking detective told me that later. When I gave my statement, he refused to tell me what exactly had been done to him, though, and for that, I think in hindsight, I'm grateful. When I think back to the look on his face, I can imagine, and that's horrible enough. They also informed me how I'd heard Ronnie's voice through the radio, then found a tape recorder near the van. They suspected he'd been listening to mine and Ronnie's transmissions through a CD that was inside the van, and recorded them, playing them back to lure me to the top floor. The one thing still makes me shudder, though, however, is trying to figure out how he recorded him saying "behind you" to me. Needless to say, I quit working as a security guard. After recovering, I eventually went to a bartending school and began working the bars across the city, including the Whiskey's, a Go-Go, where I met Jerry. She and I ended up marrying in 2009, and we ended up having a baby boy when I named in honor of my partner friend. I can't say I'm fully back to normal. I don't think anyone ever could be after such an experience. I still have nightmares about it. I feel consumed with the guilt for not having gotten to work on time that night, and filled with horror at what might have happened to me if I had. And I certainly stay far away from parking garages, but I can say I'm at least doing the best I can. I guess the reason I decided to share it after all this time is twofold. First, I guess to just share it all, especially since it barely got any mention in the papers. Not long after it happened, the papers flooded with the news of the BTK killer being captured. All poor Ronnie got was a small obituary in the paper. After all, in LA, one person being murdered is just another Tuesday, as messed up as it is. And secondly, because I went to give some advice to those who read mine and others' terrifying experiences, which are posted here. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you are faced with a terrifying, heart-stopping situation, take the advice I was given by Ronnie. Don't lose your wits. That's what leads to you getting hurt. Listen to your gut, yes, but don't forget to use your head. It may be advice that saves your life one day.